Hello and welcome to our next edition of Welty at Home. We are the virtual slow reading book club that reads a work by Eudora Welty, alternated with a work by an author connected to Welty in some way. As you all know, we are now reading and discussing The Optimist's Daughter in honor of the 50th anniversary of Welty receiving the Pulitzer Prize for this novel. Today we're discussing part 4. I'm so honored that our friend Suzanne Mars, the biographer of Eudora Welty, associated with Millsaps College. She is leading our discussions again. And I am your host, Jessica Russell. I am with the Eudora Welty House and Garden. And if you need to comment or ask a question, be sure to use the reactions button at the bottom of your screen and click the raise hand function, and we'll be looking for your question or your comment. Also, keep a good eye on the chat. There's a great discussion going on there usually with a lot of really insightful comments that we're happy to have there too. So, Suzanne, where would you like to begin part 4's discussion today?
Yeah, well, I'll start that, but should we mention we're off next week, are we not?
We are off next week for George Washington's birthday. Nobody prune your climbing roses, just your bushes.
I hope you all aren't hearing. I hope no one's hearing my dog in the background. Okay.
I'm not hearing it. We'll resume the following Monday.
I want to give a few backgrounds to part 4, but first a little background to part 3, and then we'll move on to our discussion of this final section of the novel. Last time we were talking about the cruelty of Becky's comments to Laurel, and also about the cruelty of dementia and of the consequent depression upon those who are stricken with it. The pain faced by both mother and daughter is very real. I think no blame attaches to either. And I think this was a fact that Eudora Welty recognized in her own life as she created her characters. Eudora had committed herself to her mother's care once Chestina's vision and a series of strokes incapacitated her, and then eventually forced her to place her mother in a skilled nursing facility. She chose the best facility available to her. It was the Martha Coker Nursing Home in Yazoo City, and Eudora drove there daily from Jackson to see her mother. It was 50 miles, almost 50 miles each way over hilly roads. It was not a 4-lane highway in those days, but Eudora went. But despite these heroic efforts, she was unable to assuage her mother's recurrent bouts with despair. Chestina at times bitterly resented her living situation, and at times she took out her frustration on Eudora. And I think this is a key source for Becky as we see her in the novel. But painful as it was to see her mother in such a state of mind, the daughter's love for her mother was undiminished. And Laurel's recognition of her mother's despair is Eudora's own. I'm saying this partly because on Saturday I read a column by David Brooks in which he talked about, in the New York Times, in which he talked about the death of a friend who had committed suicide, actually, and about spending time with this friend through the dark days of depression. And here's what he said about his friend all during this time. I tried to remind Pete of all the wonderful blessings he enjoyed, what psychologists called positive reframing. I've since read that this might make sufferers feel even worse about themselves for not being able to enjoy all the things that are palpably enjoyable. I learned very gradually that a friend's job in these circumstances is not to cheer the person up, it's to acknowledge the reality of the situation. It is to hear, respect, and love the person. It is to show that you haven't given up on him or her, that you haven't walked away. And I think Brooks' comment suggests a lot to us about the judge's plight in the novel, more than it does about Laurel's. Remember, the judge, Laurel thinks the judge loved his wife, Whatever she did that she couldn't help doing was all right. Whatever she was driven to say was all right, but it was not all right. Her trouble was that very desperation, and no one had the power to cause that except the one she desperately loved, who refused to consider that she was desperate. It was betrayal on betrayal. After Eudora published The Optimist's Daughter, her friend Charlotte Capers interviewed her, and Eudora told Charlotte that The Optimist's Daughter was undertaken not for therapeutic reasons, but for understanding her, for her comprehension of her own experience. And we know that there are a lot of references in the novel to people who fail to understand, to comprehend their own experience. She acknowledged, though, Eudora did, even though she said this was not for therapeutic reasons that she wrote the novel, she acknowledged that comprehension is a part of healing. And she also recognized that comprehending a situation does not mean that you can conquer the situation. She knew that Baltimore was as far a place as you could go with those you loved, and it's where they left you. So, background, one additional background to part 3. Now, part 4. Philip comes into the novel in part 4, and one source for Philip may have been Ross Macdonald, the novelist Ross Macdonald, the mystery writer who had become Eudora's friend in 1971, and she began to exchange a lot of letters with him. And one, she wrote to him, she sent him a picture of her taken in a local camellia shed, and then she said this, that was the day, finding this photo, that the memory of Cairo came back to me, Cairo, Illinois. It was once when I was going north on the train, and it was running way off schedule, so that we went through Cairo by daylight, this one time for me, and I could see from the bridge. It's the high railroad bridge and long trestle over a wide reach where the Ohio and the Mississippi, and I believe a little local river too, all come together. It took a long time to cross it, and the train went slowly, and while we were still on it, I saw high up in the light a long ragged V of birds flying south toward the river, along the river. I kept hearing in my head all the way that beautiful word, confluence, the confluence of the water. Everything the eyes could see was like the word happening. I don't remember that there were any houses or roads or people anywhere, just treetops and water and distance and sky and birds and confluence. It may not be so rare, but I thought so then, and I do now. It's all so rarely the blessing falls. So she wrote to Kenneth Miller, Ross Macdonald, about this experience, and he wrote back to her about the description. And he said to her, it reminded him of her short story, A Still Moment. And he said to her this, your convergence story, that is A Still Moment, keeps haunting me. It baffles me, as I said, perhaps because though the 3 men are influenced and go their ways, essentially the death of the heron leads only out of this world in 2 senses. I don't believe the story of the Cairo convergence that you wrote to me about has yet been written. Could you write it from now about this? Or are the involutions of your thought beyond the reach of such a simple suggestion? So he suggested that she write about this incident on the railroad bridge, and indeed she did. And after she had finished the novel, she sent this note to him. She says that she sent The Optimist's Daughter. It is so close to me that I've held on to it for 2 years, uncertain about publishing it alone as a book. It's about sad things, about a few of those things one can't ever change, but must try through fiction to make something with. The question is, did I make it? And without doing hurt to lives I cared about. I worked and hoped. There is one paragraph in it, key, that never existed in the first version at all, and it wouldn't be there now if it hadn't been for our writing each other some letters. You will know it came nearly at the end, where and when it came back to me. So the wedding journey that Laurel and Philip make and that she describes came from remembering this incident and from writing about it to Kenneth Miller, Ross MacDonald. Harriet is going to task me, I know this, to say that also Philip may well be based on John Robinson. John Robinson, a man Eudora had loved for many years, from late in the 1930s until early 1950s, when she finally relinquished hope that they might have a life together. John Robinson had not by this time died, but he had decided that he loved a man he had known in Italy from the time of World War II, and his romance with Eudora was over. They would remain friends, but that love was lost to her. There are also elements of her brother in Philip. Walter served on a minesweeper in the Pacific. Her brother Edward was an architect and had the double-jointed thumbs that she describes here. So elements of her brothers come into play, so that she's merging all of these things. There is no literal breadboard that I know of that pre-existed the novel, although subsequently Eudora was given breadboard, and there's one in the kitchen now that she was given after the novel was published. I'm sure her mother, who did make bread, had a breadboard, but I don't know if it was made by someone of close to them. One other bit, the Laurel in the novel burns her parents' letters. Eudora did not burn her parents' letters. I should say Laurel burns her father's letters to her mother. Her father has already destroyed the mother's letters to him. We have Christian Welty's letters to Chestina and hers to him. So, and they are now part of the archives collection. You can read them. We know that Eudora read them because there are notes on them in her handwriting that instructing readers as to the situation, identifying the situation. And she does quote from letters here and in one writer's beginning. So she saved them. She had evidently at one time, she told Patty Black, thought of destroying all her letters. She did not. Why she did not, we know something about that from dates subsequent to the Optimist daughter. We know that Dermot Russell proposed to give her their entire correspondence in 1973. And she wrote to Ross MacDonald about this. She said, what you said about letters seemed to apply to something Dermot told me in New York when I saw him last, that he had all the letters I'd written during the 32 years he had been my agent, and asked what he should do with them. I might have said on first impulse, in my sorrow for him now he was dying, to just get rid of them. But the thing is, I have all the other half of that correspondence, and it really is the whole factual story of my working life. And so to me, it would matter to have it. I just never would have thought of it objectively that way. I don't suppose there's a word in any of the letters that from either of us, that isn't just exactly how it was. But would other people care, or should they care? That's something else, and something I shy off from too much to think about. And Ross MacDonald wrote back to her, in the light of what you say about that career-long relationship, I can't help foreseeing a time when the letters that record it will be of the very first literary and historical importance, more valuable, I should think, than the Fitzgerald Ober correspondence, which my friend Matt Bruckley did recently. It's an important book, basic in its new field, but the Fitz-Ober relationship wasn't really imaginative or creative. My own feeling is that it led Fitzgerald away from his best self, if only providing opportunities to evade it. So he's saying, save them. Eudora's niece, Elizabeth Thompson, told her sister that she thought Eudora's reading and reviewing Virginia Woolf's letters, which she did in 1976, might have been the spark that prompted her to save her own and to give them to the Department of Archives and History. Certainly, both Kenneth Miller, Ross MacDonald, and Reynolds Price urged her to save her letters, and she did, and she gave them to the Department of Archives. And she allowed Michael Kraling to publish a book about the letters she exchanged with Dermot Russell. In fact, when he asked her about doing so, she went upstairs, got all the letters, put them in a huge garbage bag, and brought them downstairs so he could take them away to Nashville to work on them. So, her attitude towards letters did change from the doubts she had. Now, whether she well, let's just talk about this in light of what happens in The Optimist Daughter and how we're to view Laurel's decision to burn her mother's letters. We'll do that eventually, but let's start off. Let's take the part 4 in order. And why don't we start off with the section when Laurel wakes up after that dark night of the soul and has this memory of the confluence of the waters, seeing the confluence of the waters. What about this section of the novel stands out to you? Anyone want to start us off here with Philip and the memory of the wedding journey and the memories of Philip? Beverly. Thank you, Beverly.
This is really pretty much the most we get about Philip.
Yeah.
So, we've gone through 3 sections of the book, and we know he died. We know his body wasn't recovered. We know that she chose to stay in Illinois. But this section really sort of fleshes them out, even though they were young when he died. And of course, there are the autobiographical elements that he was from Ohio and, that sort of thing. But I think we get a feel for why they would have been compatible. Even he wasn't an optimist, we're told. But he had hope. And so, or faith, I've forgotten which word is used, but I think without this section, a part of Laurel would be missing. We would be saying to ourselves, like Faye does, why didn't you marry somebody else? But I think that this section I think he's developed, even though it's not a long development, I think it's developed enough that we know why she is stayed committed to him, even though he was gone so many years ago and so in such a short time in their marriage.
Eudora wrote a lot more about Philip than she finally put in. So she pared it back, and this is what we have now. And we have that sense of how they are different and how they are compatible. Yeah, Joellen and then Pearl.
I was just going to point out that it's important that Philip Hand was a country boy. We've already heard that Dr. Cortland had country aspects that she respected. And we're told that connected to being a country boy is soft-spokenness, selfless energy, and long-range plans. So there's kind of an idealizing of that. But Laurel chooses to spend the rest of her life in the city. She dresses for the city, does her hair for the city, and goes back to the city.
Like a country boy, like an Ohio country boy, as her father was, as Mr. Welty was. I should have mentioned that. Pearl, I hope you're going to refer to what you said last time as well, because I think what happens here builds on that.
Oh, well, you'll have to remind me what that was.
I will. Yeah, go.
But I think it was Peggy Prenshaw that wrote a beautiful essay about Philip Hand and the importance of his part in the novel. And I think she concentrates on the line that's on page 980, where Welty writes, he taught her, Laurel, to draw, to work toward and into her pattern, not to sketch peripheries. And that goes along beautifully with what you've sketched out to begin with, how the novel and the writing of the novel is also a description of Welty's mindset and process for figuring out her life experience to work toward the center in order to find your pattern. So that's just what I wanted to add.
I was going to ask you, Pearl, I was meant to quote you earlier when you were talking about the ending of section 3 of Phil saying, I wanted it, and the hope that you found in that. And then this memory of Philip, which is so hopeful the next morning.
Yeah. Well, as you know, as she writes, the memories are the living thing, that the memories don't go away. So.
Well, and so the memory, which is the most devastating, the memory of his loss, is also the fact that he continues to live in her memory, and that he's been vulnerable to the living moment. And then the next living moment is the much more positive memory of their union.
I sort of think about how Laurel has discovered her parents' young life, and that young life wasn't perfect. And that helps her to lead back into her memories about Phil and that their marriage. And it was only perfect in her memories because it can't continue to be perfect because he's absent. So I think she learns from her parents' early marriage and the realities of that relationship, something that helps her to live with the aloneness after Philip.
All right, Harriet.
So I'm thinking about Philip and love and protection, and the issue of protection throughout this novella. Thinking about the passage, which is, until she knew Phil, she thought of love as shelter. He had shown her that this need not be so. Protection, like self-protection, fell away from her like all one garment, some anachronism foolishly saved from childhood. I'm thinking about all the kinds of protection that we've looked at in the novel, beginning back with protection of the eye, and the way in which the judge is restrained in order to protect the eye. I'm thinking about Major Bullock's desire to protect that poor little woman, the helpless kind. I'm thinking about the protection of the bodies of the dead when Tish is concerned about protecting the judge's body from the eyes of others, and the memory of the judge protecting Becky's body. But now we get we get into the protection of memories in Laurel. The protection of memories of her parents, and then of Phil, keeping this marriage in its ideal state. And I'm thinking about the connection between Phil teaching Laurel to draw, and to draw the centers and not the peripheries, being connected to what he teaches her about love and giving up its protection. I'm thinking over to One Writer's Beginnings, and a sheltered life can be a daring life as well. For all serious daring starts within. That is, we're there too, thinking about sheltering and daring. And I'm remembering the moment when she says in One Writer's Beginnings, exposing yourself to risk is a truth that Miss Eckhart and I had in common. That is so much of the book is connected to the idea of escaping protection into risk, which is positive, which is love, which is lots of things.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up too. And I was going to say that when Eudora first met Kenneth Miller in New York, and they went out to that evening, and she said he was much more, he saw people running from the police, and It was alien to her, but he wasn't disturbed by it. He was much more open to the danger. And so she's thinking of that, I think, sort of relationship as well, probably out. But I think that whole issue of protection, thank you for tracing it. That's great. Susan. Oh, we're missing Susan. You're muted.
Sorry, as long as we're on 979 and 980, I just wanted to make, this is one of my favorite quotes in the whole book, is that paragraph when it says, left bodies and graveless of a death made of water and fire and a year long gone. Phil could still tell her of her life. For her life, any life she had to believe was nothing but the continuity of its love. And I think that really speaks to where she is. And even though the women are, you know, why didn't she marry somebody else or whatever? But I think Eudora had these long-term relationships, even though they didn't work out, and her sympathy for that and the idea of the continuity of love, I think, goes right in there with the confluence. And
I love that passage
love
too.
that
Yeah.
passage. So I didn't want us
And-
to miss it.
Yeah. And that love continues after a person dies, that her
Right.
love for her parents, her love for her brothers, her love for her mother is ongoing. And that's the meaning of life to her. It's not the meaning of life for Faye. And I think it's also a suggestion as the meaning of life for Phil. He takes risk. He will risk his life for the sake of the nation and for the sake, and he will risk himself for her sake. For family, his love for her mother. It's all his life meaning comes out of love, extending his love, as it does for Laurel. Instead of saying, why don't you get up out of that bed and see what you can do for me?
Right.
Yeah. Okay. Here I go on Faye again. I'll let her off the hook eventually. Sarah, your turn.
I raised my hand before Susan spoke, but I think I'm in a very much a similar vein. Harriet was thinking about the connections to the memoir in terms of protection, but I've been thinking about them in terms of how you might shape or think about time. In that memoir, time is very much layered instead of chronological. So Welty will think of something and it will trace back to a previous time and then to a more recent one, instead of thinking past, present, future, nicely lined up. And I think in this passage, that word continuity really gives us the sense of a layering of time instead of chronological. You know, Faye says, I'm a character of the future. Faye definitely is thinking about chronological time when she asks Laurel, you know, why haven't you moved on? But for Laurel, everything is present. The Phil is still there. The continuity is still there. And we get Welty's sense of time as kind of layered instead of moving in one direction, I think, in both of those books.
Yeah, thank you. Here's the line from one writer's beginnings. The memory is a living thing. It too is in transit, but during its moment, all that is remembered joins and lives. The old and the young, the past and the present, the living and the dead. So yeah, thank you, Sarah. Anything else about this first section and about the introduction of Philip? Jessica.
I just wanted to connect right back to what Sarah was saying before we leave that thought about the living and the dead. And I think about the quote you just read from the memoir, One Writer's Beginnings, when we're in the novel, The Optimist's Daughter, at the funeral scene. And there's a reference to the camellia that Laurel thought that her father was going to be buried under next to her mother Becky, but how it stood big as a pony saddled with unplucked blooms, living and dead. And I just think it's such a beautiful image of a camellia with both living and dead flowers on one plant. So just connecting that.
Oh, thank you. I hadn't made that connection. Thanks. Cheryl.
So, excuse me, I agree with all of the comments made about Phil so far, especially in that he was a true partner to her who helped bring forth her artistic talent by explaining, you can draw from the outside in. So it was like they were equally yoked, they benefited each other. And I also like how Welty describes Philip's hands, that they are large, good hands, signifying like hard work. And remember, he put himself through college, it says, and he chose his school based on very practical reasonings, that it was affordable and that was in warm weather. But so the description of Philip's hands and that he wanted to be an architect and design homes for people reminded me of the short story The Winds, when the hurricane's coming and the daughter notices that the father's arms, the shadow, like shadows the whole house. Like he's the protector. He's the one who built and still protects the house.
Yeah, that story really is about protection and daring as well. Yeah. Joe Ellen. Whoops, we can't hear you. You're muted.
Sorry, I just wanted to draw our attention before we move on to one sentence from the confluence passage on page 1, that about the faint line of birds within the crystal of the zenith, flying in a V of their own. I've never really bothered with, okay, what does this mean? What the definition of a crystal, definition of a zenith. And I understand the zenith point as in its astrological business, but the crystal, a crystal has surface regularity, that it reflects its internal symmetry. And that definition makes me understand why Welty chose it, unless somebody else can clarify that for me more. But the crystal of the zenith, I've always felt was just odd.
I focused on it more this time than I ever had before, I think because we're reading slowly.
Yeah.
And it is such a striking image. Anyone else want to comment about that? The crystal of the, let me get the exact phrasing. Is it the crystal
of the zenith?
Yeah. The long, ragged, pencil-faint line of birds within the crystal of the zenith, flying in a V of their own, following the same course down. It is so amazing too, all of this total thing of confluence or convergence, which is the key theme and the key consolation here. Pearl.
Joe Ellen's attention to the meaning of a crystal and what a crystal does is beautiful. I had always just thought it was the idea of the refraction of the light at the zenith that also sort of caught her eye, but this, refraction representing the center is also a beautiful idea. She's looking for the center of the patterns that she's thinking about. So thank you, Joe Ellen.
Does it have Beverly?
I was just going to mention about Philip's hands again, the description that Laurel gives when she's about to beat Faye to death with the breadboard, which some of us wish might have happened. But when she describes that, how painstaking he was the one in the family who could make things. We were a family of comparatively helpless people. That's what so bound us together. My mother blessed him when she saw this. She thought it was sound and beautiful and correctly suited to her long felt needs. And then he had the gift of his hands. He planed, fitted, glued, clamped. It's made on the true look and see. It's still straight as his T-square, tongued and grooved. That idea of not only the perfection of his work, but his hands as he perfected this breadboard, which is apparently a work of art.
Yeah, so he's not an optimist, but he is a perfectionist.
Right.
Let me just ask you one more thing about the crystal and the zenith. I've always thought of it as seeing the arch, in the sky, and the crystal is a kind of crystal on a watch, which is within that zenith and that whole question of time and that sense of order and of direction and of beauty from that. So there some more musings on that. Okay, let's go to the breadboard and Beverly and well, let me hold up a minute. First, let's talk about Laurel burning the letters. Before Faye shows up, before we have this passage about the breadboard, Laurel burns her mother's papers on page 985. Let me see this described. For the next hour, Laurel stood in the driveway, burning her father's letters to her mother and grandma's letters and the saved little books and papers in the rescue wire basket where pecan leaves used to get burned. Too acid for my roses. She burned Milton's universe. She saw the words "this morning?" with the uncompromising hook of her mother's question mark on a little round scrap of paper that was slowly growing smaller in the smoke. She had a child's desire to reach for it, like a coin left lying in the street for any passerby to find and legitimately keep. By then it was consumed. So how do you respond to Laurel's doing this? Is this a way of freeing her hands, of finding those hands pardoned and freed? Is it a mistake? How do we reconcile it with the fact that we know that Eudora Welty saved all these letters? Cheryl, what do you think?
I think that this is entirely Laurel's business. It's her decision. She is the only child of those two people, and it's up to her to decide what they mean to her. So Sarah talked about like time, right? Putting this novel in the context of time, and the phrase that Welty chooses for us to have Laurel read is "this morning?" ? So a morning, a birth of new possibilities. Becky expressing hope for something in her relationship with the judge. Like that's just to focus on this morning question. And Laurel burns it, but it could be burning. It's her business is where I leave it. It's what meant something to her.
All right, so it's a personal decision, not a philosophical statement. Harriet.
Yeah, I wanted to connect the birds in our V back through the bird in the house to the burning of these letters. And I'm thinking about, the bird is it's easy to connect the bird which flies through the house and soils everything with Faye, but I'm more inclined to feel that the more profound connection is to Laurel. And when Mr. Cheek says, the bird isn't trying to get in, it's trying to get out. And Laurel saying, I'm holding the door open for it. It's got a perfectly clear way out now. Why won't it just fly free of its own accord? I think that the issue for Laurel of her connection to the house and the past and flying free of it, to her connection to the loss and to what she feels and being able to fly free of it. Her father's the optimist and the protector, but Laurel has internalized that habit of protection that the judge had with Becky, and Becky is facing the horror of things, and so I'm just thinking about the act of burning these letters. Is it an act of protecting her parents? Is it an act of freeing herself from the physical, the most oppressive sense of the house and the memories, or what?
There's an interesting quote on page 990 after Phil comes back and Faye confronts her, and Laurel thinks she saw herself pursuing her own way through the house as single-mindedly as Faye had pursued hers through the ceremony, the day of the funeral. that she is in a sense trying to protect her mother from Faye. And burning those papers is a way to protect, is an act of trying to protect. But I think you're right. In a way, also, she realizes that even without them, she now has access to memories. It's not that she needed to do this to protect. And in fact, they might have enriched her life in the future. I mean, to me, I have a kind of horror of doing this. But she has discovered access to the past and memory and is liberated in that sense, I think. Sarah?
I think you just said what I was going to say. So I will just an underscore. I don't think she needs the letters anymore. I don't think it's that she doesn't value her parents or those memories. It's just that she has become her parents' daughter. So she doesn't need the letters. She just read them. They are internalized now. I also think it's interesting, a way of claiming her parents' lives. She's the only one who has the right to burn those letters. Destruction is a form of claiming property, and she's claiming the property of those letters, and they can't do anything about them if she burns them. And so I think it's really a way of claiming them and of declaring that they are hers now. But yes, the historian in me, the literary critic in me, always hurts when I read it.
Yeah. Well, in a way, she wouldn't have had access to the past without discovering those objects from the past. They've granted her access to the past. Yeah, let's see, I think it's Joellen, and I'm not sure of your name.
Harriet,
I
do you
know
have
it's
something more to say?
no, it's not Janice Williams, though. Mr. Williams. Okay, Joellen. And Harriet, are you still up?
I was just going to say that, that I think this very act is replayed in the breadboard. It's like
Yeah.
we're going to see
Yeah.
it, and the idea of finding the key to something in the past, but also no longer needing the key once you've gone through the door.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you. I love that metaphor. Yeah. And the breadboard, she wants to take it with her. But when Faye lays claim to it, she's okay. I'll leave it. I don't need it anymore. Joellen.
It's true that I think she intended to take it with her. But like the stone boat,
Right.
it would not have burned easily. And there's a question about whether she takes the stone boat. We don't know absolutely. But she seems to burn only paper. And if any of your memories are like mine, I would need a reread in the future. And so it seems to me something of a mistake, because she did rediscover all of this whole world opening up to her. And then the second point, Laurel could have taken the letters. She didn't need to leave them for Faye there to discover. So anyway, this section's always been I felt ambivalent about it.
Well, we know that Eudora Welty saved them. We know she saved the stone boat. It's on display at the Welty Visitor Center. So, yeah. All right. Yes. Yes, sir. I'm not. Are you up there? Are you unmuted? Yeah. We can't.
Thank
now.
you. It's I know it's terrible to descend from the profound to the mundane, but in the burning of the letters, and I'm sure the meaning is as has been discussed, but the other thing to call to mind is that customarily in families like the McKelvers, in places like Mount Salus, after the death of a family member, particularly when one is the last of the line, it was customary, harsh, and many of us resent that it was, for personal letters to be burned, personal effects to be burned, and in some cases, even photographs and other personal mementos of the deceased were destroyed. Excuse me for bringing that up, but I think it was widely customary in parts
All
of
right,
the South.
so this may, yeah, it may have been a custom. Now, of course, there are lots of people who didn't, because the Department of Archives is filled with collections of
And God
family
bless
papers.
them,
Yeah, thank
instead
you.
of those who've had to, of us who, for whom there were burners in the background.
Right, that's right, yeah. Cheryl,
So, speaking of what Mr. Williams just said, when Adele comes up the lane and sees that Laurel's burning the letters, she's, you know, she doesn't judge her, which could, so that could be part of the reason why. But also, we're talking about the bird in the house, and there's two different times that the bird, that there is a chimney swift that invades the house. It happens in part 3, but also in part 4. And Welty gives very vivid language to like the bird first goes into Laurel's room, and then it shoots like an arrow into her parents' room, like that. Those are the exact words that she's using. And this bird, I believe, is symbolic of Faye being a sparrow, because in part 3, they say there's a cardinal and there's mockingbirds, but it's Faye who the ladies say is like a sparrow, invasive.
like a sparrow, yeah. Yeah, Laurel takes the little finger tracks of fingernail polish off the desk. They're tracks, they're like bird tracks. So that's, yeah, thank you, Cheryl. So there are those allusions to Faye. Somebody, there we go. I'm having unknown callers. I thought I'd turn my phone off, but so now it's off. Okay, so shall we talk about the confrontation with Faye, the confrontation between Laurel and Faye? What do you make of that? Pearl.
Well, I want to ask, before we even dissect all of that, about the line on 991. When Laurel says, or the narrator says, she had been ready to hurt Faye. She had wanted to hurt her and had known herself capable of doing it. I think this is a great insight into Laurel and the progress that she has made to be able to fix herself. But I don't understand this. But such is the strangeness of the mind. It had been the memory of the child Wendell that had prevented her. What are we supposed to make of that, you wise people?
What I've always made of it, and we'll see what other people think, is that she had looked at Wendell and she thought of Wendell as an unvindictive Faye, a young version of Faye, without the destructiveness of Faye. And that when she thinks of him, she thinks of what Faye might have been, and doesn't strike out against her. But I think you're right that this is the mark that she had been ready to do it, that she has not confronted Faye in the past. When she thought she should have shouted abuse, she did not do it. Now she's shouting abuse, and she's not stifling that emotion. She's freed herself from that kind of repression. Harriet.
Yeah, I think it is a remarkably even-handed encounter between these two women. On the one hand, it is Laurel's moment of speaking her mind, of finding her voice, and at another level, Faye is presented, in ways that make her entirely objectionable, and at the same time, is her best moment. When she says that when she explains that what she had wanted with the judge was to make him live, that she was being a wife, and that she wanted it, which is an echo of Phil. I don't think in a debasing way. I think that we see something that Laurel is potentially learning from in connection with Faye and Faye's other way of being, which is that sense of her of Laurel also wanting it, and so this encounter is something positive for Laurel, and Faye is not entirely made into a gargoyle in the episode. I was also thinking about the scene, to go on with what Pearl was talking about. I'm thinking about the moment when she raises the breadboard as if to hit Faye with it. And it makes me think across to the moment when Mrs. Larkin raises a rake against the gardening boy,
Jamie.
Jamie, and stops herself with that repeat of feeling of loss and striking out and checking yourself.
Let me just say one other thing about Faye. I think you're right. At first with Faye, it's what were you trying to scare father into when you struck him? And she says, I was trying to scare him into living. And that's a kind of positive thing. And then Laurel says, you what? And then Faye says, I wanted him to get up out of there and start paying a little attention to me for a change. And there it goes.
Yeah.
So she gives to Faye with one hand, but she takes it right back the next line. Yeah, Joe Ellen.
I was just going to say that this moment resonates for me when Laurel tells Missouri not to touch the bird, and also putting that together with her comment that we were a family not especially capable. And so that I haven't quite worked out the connection in my mind, but both Mr. Cheek and Missouri are right. All birds need to fly. They raise points that Laurel hadn't, perhaps really thought of, even though she's the one that says, birds will fly to light and opens the door and gets it out. But she really has to learn here from a similar kind of moment where she has the breadboard raised and is capable of acting, perhaps more, though she chooses not to here.
Thank you. Anything else about this? Should we look at the last lines before we run out of time, which are so beautiful?
I think Beverly has her hand up.
Oh, Beverly, go.
I was just going to say, in relation to her saying that thinking about Wendell stopped her,
Yeah.
and that possibly she had a moment of sympathy for the way that Faye was brought up. There's a line I was listening to the Audible version of Eudora reading this book today, and early on she's described as she and Laurel are contrasted in how they look and what they have on. And there's a phrase describing Faye that says she's so small and fragile looking that she looks like she might have been malnourished in the past. So, maybe she was abused in some way. Maybe that's why she killed off her family. We see when they're there, they're all over, but the fact that Eudora goes to the trouble to tell us that she looks like she might have been malnourished, and then we have this connection with Wendell as well, that maybe she deserves a little more sympathy than I'm willing to give her.
Right.
But
we should have also said something about the breadboard, I think. And that is that Laurel says it's the whole solid past. And the past means nothing to Faye. And the past means everything to Laurel. But then she realizes that the past, she says, has been everything and done everything to me, everything for me. The past is no more open to help or hurt than was father in his coffin. The past is like him, impervious, and can never be awakened. It is the memory that is the somnambulist. It will come back in its wounds from across the world like Phil, calling us by our names and demanding its rightful tears. It will never be impervious. The memory can be hurt time and again, but in that may lie its final mercy. As long as it's vulnerable to the living moment, it lives for us. And while it lives, and while we are able, we can give it up its due. And that notion that even the painful memory keeps the past alive is, I think, so important, that there is even a virtue in the memory that is painful. the past does live. So, so she leaves, memory lived not in the initial possession, but in the freed hands, pardoned and freed, and in the heart that can empty but fill again in the patterns restored by dreams. So what comments there, Harriet?
Yeah, I was just going to say that that the board is a solid past, but it's also craftsmanship. Again, I'm connecting memory with art, with making, and the two things that Phil teaches her. Of course, I'm thinking about Eudora now rather than Laurel, but thinking about the connection between memory and craftsmanship, making.
Craftsmanship, imagination, the idea of conceiving it. I always knew whenever I heard Eudora say someone, if he would say, he has no imagination, that was about the worst thing she'd ever say about anyone. He has no imagination. And so the importance of the imagination, the importance of art, the importance of craftsmanship here, yeah. And that memory and its patterns of memory, understanding your experience, making sense of it. And the way Eudora understood patterns and made sense of them was to write fiction. Anything else, Pearl?
I always think about at the end of this novel, I think about Virgie Rainey and how she has lived through her experience in the Golden Apples, and then and like Laurel is moving out. She's understood the past. She's dealt with all of the people around her, and she's not making judgments on them, but she's just going to move on to have her own life. So in that sense, and I've always admired Virgie for being able to leave and go on with her life. And so I think we might be able to think that same thing for Laurel here, except that, the very ending, a lot of people talk about this is very Dickinsonian, like Emily Dickinson's poem, because of the raising of the hands and passing and so on and so forth. But that poem by Dickinson is about, because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. So while I want to have a positive reading, I think about how, so maybe it is the death of that past kept alive only through memory, therefore not needing the breadboard, not needing the letters. Anyway, so just a lot of jumbled up thoughts. I'm not nearly organized.
I would say not only through memory, but only in memory is the past, does the past live, only in memory. And there's a comfort in that, except that our memories are need to be passed on to others. Yeah. So, Joellen and Sarah.
Please let Sarah go ahead. I just have a passage I'd like to mention if we have time for help.
All right. Thank you, Sarah.
I just think it's kind of interesting that it takes her father's death for Laurel to let go of her mother. I mean, this is her mother's breadboard, her mother's letters, and I think it's just interesting that it's her father's death that leads back to her memories of her mother's death. And this is the moment, as Pearl says, she's kind of going off independent. Whereas I think mistakenly had in my head that in Welty, it was often the death of the mother that lets the daughter kind of do this. But the death of the mother's happened years before. So I just think it's interesting that it's taken the father's death to allow Laurel to do this.
It's almost taken the end of the family. I mean, the loss of her mother, her husband, and now her father. Yeah.
I just want to mention a paragraph that begins in the middle of page 988, which perhaps we can take up in 2 weeks when we're talking about the novel as a whole. But it's the one that starts, experience did finally get set into its right order, where Laurel has been telling Faye, my mother predicted you. And it's really an odd paragraph. And I'm not quite sure how to interpret that and to fit it in here. to what's happening to Laurel, to what it says about Becky as well, positive or negative. So anyway, that's one I would really like to talk about later.
All right, good. I think that's an important one, and I think it harkens back to the passage about the betrayal that of not recognizing her desperation, but it's different, so we should talk about it. Okay, Cheryl, last
I was just
comment.
going to say that we can continue the chat on the Welty Garden Facebook page.
All right, chat can continue. We'll be off for a week. Then we're going to start with the New Yorker version and look at how it changed into the novel and what we can learn from that, what it tells us about Welty's intent, what it tells us about the import. And we also know that sometimes the second version is not better than the first. So we'll look at which do we prefer between these two and why. So Jessica, anything else for today?
I think we've covered it. It was such a great discussion. Thank you so much, everyone.
Yes, thank everyone. Thank you all.
Oh, Jessica, are you sending us the story? Or
We are working on a way to get scans, so stay tuned on that. It will probably be pretty close to our first discussion, but thankfully it's not a long,
So
not thankfully,
eventually,
don't read it.
as a friend of
Eventually.
mine used to say, eventually.
Eventually.
All right. All right.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.